So you've got a climate project and you're claiming it's making a real difference. How do I, as a verifier, know you're right? Well, my rulebook is ISO 14064-2. And in this breakdown, we're going to get right into the nuts and bolts of it. We're not just reading the standard, we're going to look at the why behind every rule so you can build a project that's bulletproof when it comes to verification.
All right, let's kick things off. First, we need to get our heads around the core problem this standard is actually trying to solve, because it's a really unique accounting puzzle that sits at the heart of every single climate project out there. So here it is. This is the big question. How do you measure something that didn't actually happen? I mean, that's the whole game, right? A project claims it cut emissions compared to a world that, well, a world that doesn't exist. So the whole reason we have this standard is to give us a credible, consistent way to actually put a number on that hypothetical difference.
Now, this is a really, really important distinction to make. Think about a regular company's carbon footprint. That's covered by Part 1 of the standard. That's basically a historical record, right? It's a snapshot of what actually happened. But a project under Part 2, that's completely different. It's a comparison. It's what did happen versus what would have happened. And because of that, you need a way more rigorous logic. Otherwise, it's just way too easy to invent credits out of thin air. So the key takeaway here is this. Project accounting isn't really about measuring emissions. It's about measuring the change in emissions. We're not just counting tons. We're building a case, a verifiable argument that our actions caused a specific, quantifiable change compared to what would have been. In ISO 14064-2, that's the rulebook that tells us how to make that argument bulletproof.
Okay, so to measure that change, the standard makes us do something really specific. We have to define two different worlds with a ton of precision, the world with our project and the world without it. Getting these definitions right is absolutely foundational.
First up, we've got the GHG project itself. The standard is pretty clear on this. It's the activity or activities that change things from how they would have been. You know, it's the real-world stuff. Building the wind farm, reforesting an area. This is the world that actually exists, and the standard demands that you describe its boundaries and everything you're doing in painstaking detail.
And then there's the other world, the hypothetical one, the baseline scenario. Now, this can't just be some random guess. The standard is very specific. It has to be the most likely thing that would have happened if your project never existed. And let me tell you, from a verifier's point of view, proving that your baseline is truly the most likely one, that's one of the toughest, most important hurdles you're going to face.
So, this is how it boils down. You have to calculate the emissions for both worlds. The baseline world, what would have happened, and the project world, what actually did happen. The difference between those two numbers? That's your claimed reduction. Simple concept, right? But making sure both of those numbers are credible, that's where all the hard work comes in.
So the big takeaway is that the reduction is just the difference between the baseline and the project. But how do we make sure that number is real and not just some creative accounting? Well, the standard gives us three main pillars of proof that as a verifier, I'm going to test rigorously.
All right, this section is really the heart of the standard. It's where you prove your impact. Think of it like a three-legged stool. If you get all three legs right, your project is stable and solid. But if even one of them is weak, the whole thing just falls apart. So that first leg is the baseline. When I'm looking at a project, the very first thing I'm digging into is the justification for the baseline scenario. It needs to be robust and backed by evidence. The standard is mandatory here. It says you shall look at all the plausible alternatives and prove why yours is the most realistic. A poorly justified baseline means the claim is dead on arrival. It's that simple. Next up, the second leg, additionality. This is a big one. It's the "but would have it happened anyway" test. The whole idea is to prove that your reductions are in addition to what would have happened normally. You have to show, for example, that your project isn't just business as usual. Maybe you have to prove it faced some big financial hurdles that wouldn't have been overcome without the project's climate finance, or that it wasn't already required by law. Because if it was going to happen anyway, then it's not additional, and you can't claim any credit for it. And don't just take my word for it. The standard itself makes this crystal clear. It says additionality is inherent to the baseline. That means it's not some separate optional checkbox. You literally can't separate the two. Proving your project is additional is what makes your baseline credible in the first place. And that brings us to the third leg, which is all about quantification, and specifically the principle of conservativeness. This is the golden rule for any project developer, and for us verifiers. The standard commands that if you're ever in doubt, if there's any uncertainty, you must use the assumption or value that is least likely to overstate your claim.
So, if you have a range of possible emission factors, you have to pick the one that gives you the smallest, most conservative reduction number. No exceptions. Okay, a little pro tip here for anyone working with this standard. Don't skip the annexes. Seriously, they are not optional reading. Think of Annex A as your project's constitution. It lists all the fundamental principles like transparency, accuracy, and that conservativeness we just talked about. As a verifier, these principles are my first checkpoint. And Annex B, that's your practical guidebook. If you're stuck on how to select a baseline or prove additionality, Annex B gives you concrete steps and ideas. It's the standard's way of helping you solve the trickiest part. So let's wrap this section up. Remember that three-legged stool. Your claim stands on a defensible baseline, proven additionality, and conservative quantification. My job as the verifier is to come in and kick each one of those legs. If any one of them wobbles, the whole thing is coming down. The entire claim is invalid.
Okay, so a project's impact doesn't always stay neatly inside its little box. There can be side effects, and the standard requires you to account for two really important ones: leakage and reversals.
Let's talk about leakage. This is a huge concept. Imagine your project protects a patch of forest from being cut down. Great. But what if that just caused the loggers to move over and cut down the forest next door instead? If that happens, you haven't created a net benefit for the climate. You've just moved the problem. The standard says you have to look for that risk, and if it's significant, you have to quantify it and subtract it from your claim.
Then we have reversals. This is especially important for carbon removal projects, like forestry. I mean, think about it. If you grow a forest that pulls carbon out of the air for 10 years, but then it burns down in a wildfire, well, that climate benefit is gone. It's been reversed. This gets at the core issue of permanence. So the standard requires you to assess that risk and have a plan in place to monitor and deal with it for the long haul.
So after you've designed the project, done all the calculations, and collected all your data, what do you do with it? You have to put it all together in a GHG report. This report is your formal claim, where you lay out everything from your baseline to your leakage assessment. I like to think of the GHG report as your evidence locker. It's not just about the final number you're claiming. It's the whole story of how you got to that number. As a verifier, I need to see everything: a crystal clear monitoring plan, good quality data, and documentation for every assumption, every methodology, every single calculation. You have to be totally transparent, because if I can't trace your steps and follow your logic, I simply can't verify your claim. All right, last section. We've talked about building the claim. Now let's talk about how that claim gets its credibility out in the real world, and that's through independent third-party verification. So here's an important detail. Your project is designed using Part 2 of the standard. But the actual audit, that's governed by a different rulebook, ISO 14064-3. That's the standard for people like me, the verifiers. It sets out all the rules for how we have to do our job, our competence, our impartiality, the exact steps we have to follow to make sure that a verified claim means the same thing no matter where you are in the world. And that really brings us to the final, most important question you should be asking yourself. Is your climate claim built to be verified? The biggest takeaway I can give you is this: don't just design a project to have an impact. Design it from the very first day to be provable. Think like a verifier. Document everything. Justify everything. Because honestly, a climate claim that can't be independently verified, it's just a good intention. But a project built on the solid foundation of ISO 14064-2, that is a credible, quantifiable, and verifiable contribution. And that's the whole point.